and welcome to South2North, coming to you from the Wits University campus in Johannesburg, South Africa. To billions of people across the world, the 14th of February is synonymous with flowers, chocolates, and love letters. This year, however, just a few miles from here, it wasn't the union of two lovers that marked Valentine's Day, but their tragic separation. Olympic hero Oscar Pistorius shot dead his girlfriend Riva Steenkamp. As Oscar Pistorius returns to court this week, it's, as so often before, not only the man pulling the trigger who's under scrutiny, but also gun violence itself. Hundreds of thousands of people fall victim to gun violence every single year. From the Breivik mass killing in Norway to the countless school shootings in the United States. Guns in the wrong hands have devastating consequences for communities worldwide. So is there anything that we, our politicians and our police can do about this? Joining us from Tokyo, we have Jake Edelstein, Japan-based investigative crime reporter and author. And later with me in the studio, I'll be joined by Richard Feldman, president of the American Independent Firearm Owners Association, as well as author and researcher Anthony Altbierker, who has spent 20 years specializing in writing about police work. But first, let's start with Jake. Jake, good evening. Welcome to South2North. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's very nice to be here, Edie.
Thank you. Now, before we start with guns, I'm very fascinated by your own personal journey. From a small town called Missouri, how did you transform to being author of Tokyo's Vice and a leading investigative reporter on gangsters and crime in Japan?
I went to university in Japan, and I joined a Japanese newspaper, and the first assignment I got was the police beat, and on my second year as a reporter, they assigned me to cover the organized crime task force. When you're assigned to cover something as a reporter in Japan and the hours are very long, you grow to know your subject matter very well.
Jake, let's talk about your book for a minute, Tokyo's Vice. I understand it's about to be turned into a Hollywood film, also featuring Daniel Radcliffe. Tell me about that.
Daniel Radcliffe read the book and liked it very much and wanted to play me, which is really odd because I'm a real person and not a fictional character. And the book isn't just about Yakuza, it's about what is ethical and not ethical to do as an investigative journalist.
It came at a great cost for you and your family. Tell me what happened. Do you still live under police protection?
I am still under police protection. The police come down and check at my house like twice a day. Here's the deal. Goro Tadamasa was one of the most powerful crime bosses in Japan, and I wrote an article about a deal he made with the FBI to get into the United States and get liver transplant, and he wasn't very happy with it because it discussed the fact that he ratted out his fellow gang members, and in general in the Yakuza, which is Japanese organized crime, if you betray the people in the organization, they don't like you.
I'm now curious to know how you were able to get into that world. It's very difficult to write a book about criminals and gangs unless you win their trust.
Well, I mean, the Yakuza are nasty, but they have a public image. They portray themselves as humanitarian organizations. The Yakuza traditionally have a certain code of ethics, and the code of ethics is don't kill civilians, don't steal, don't rob, don't engage in sexual assault. But blackmail, extortion, collecting protection money, fraud, bid rigging, those things are okay. I don't think there's any country in the world where the mafia is such an acknowledged presence.
All right, let's talk then about gun legislation in Japan. Japan is regarded as one of the safest countries in the world where gun violence is really low. How are organizations like the Yakuza able to exist?
After the Second World War, the United States disarmed Japan. In 1946, they forbid anyone other than soldiers and the police to have guns to preserve a fragile democracy. So actually, the United States is capable of disarming a country. They're just not capable of disarming themselves. The gun laws in Japan are incredibly strict. It is a crime to fire a gun. It is a crime to own a bullet. It is a crime to own a bullet and a gun that match. That's an aggravated felony. That'll get you life in prison. You just can't have a gun in Japan. Mm-hmm. And even criminals don't want to use guns because if you have a gun and you fire it, then that criminal is going to go to jail, or that Yakuza member is going to go to jail, probably for life. The organization will have to take care of him and his family, which is very expensive, and it isn't worth it. I mean, if you really need to take out another Yakuza, you can use a knife, you can use a car, you can use other weapons. I think In 2011, there were 8 homicides, and only 2 of the homicides were Yakuza. That's, for a nation of like 122 million people, 8 gun deaths, that's not a lot.
So in your views, is the answer to the proliferation of guns in our society, is the answer more legislation? Is it the legislation that's working in Japan?
You have to have legislation, you have to have enforcement, you have to have police officers who do nothing but round up people who have guns. A law doesn't mean anything if it's not promulgated, if it's not strictly enforced, and if you don't have the manpower to enforce it. It works in Japan because the police are very serious about it. The penalties are extreme. They are heavily enforced, and there are departments of every police department in the country that are devoted to dealing with gun-related crimes.
The gun lobbyists where I come from in South Africa argue that they need to protect themselves against the criminal. So first, the country must deal with its crime problem before they discard their guns. In your view, what comes first, crime control, or the society must be disarmed?
Well, look at Japan. In 1946, they disarmed themselves. I mean, they had a couple years of guns still floating around, but basically right now, Japan has a very low homicide rate. It's very safe. There aren't mass shootings. There aren't people going on shooting sprees in shopping malls or in movie theaters. So it works. You just have to devote the manpower to doing it all at once. I believe that Australia did the same thing a few years ago. They had a terrible mass shooting. The government decided we are going to strictly regulate handguns. They put laws on the books. Within 3 months, they enforced them, and it's been a much safer society since then.
You come originally from the United States. What, in your view, is the obstacle to disarming the United States?
Well, in the Constitution of the United States, the right to bear arms is clearly written down. Now, in the context of the original Constitution, it's the right to bear arms within a militia, and what the meaning of those words has been hotly debated. So Japan doesn't have the right to bear arms in its constitution, so there's not a legal obstacle in that sense. If the United States really wants to ban handguns, they probably are going to have to change that part of the Constitution.
Jake, thank you very much for joining us on South2North, live from Tokyo. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
Right now, we'll be joined by Richard Feldman, who heads up the American Independent Firearm Owners Association. A former police officer and advisor to several U.S. presidents, Mr. Feldman has dedicated most of his career to protecting the rights of gun owners and the firearms industry. Richard, welcome to South2North. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Why so many guns in the world? I read somewhere that there is enough ammunition to kill each person twice, so billions worth of ammunition, and also that firearms outnumber passenger vehicles by 23%. That's a high number. Why so many guns?
Well, I don't really know the answer to that, other than in my country, lots of gun owners own lots of guns. I own well over 150, but I only own one vehicle.
Why do you own so many guns then?
Well, every gun is a little different, and I collect stamps, I collect coins, I collect guns.
But guns kill people, stamps don't. Why would anyone need 150 firearms?
Well, I'm a shooter, and I do competitive shooting, different calibers, different types, different forms. It's like a golfer may own lots of different golf clubs, but the real answer is it's not about need. It's about I enjoy them. I've never misused a gun I own. I have used them defensively several times. The problem is never the gun per se. The problem is always in whose hands are the guns.
But how do you determine that? Because that's the problem. The vetting process is not efficient. And in the United States right now, they've just recently rejected a piece of legislation that would have made it easier for people to be tested and to be vetted.
In my country, we've decided to err on the side of the people rather than to err on the side of the government. What people around the world don't often recognize about the United States of America, it's not about the gun per se. It's basically people responding to the view, does the government trust me with the guns I've owned for 30, 40 years? Or all of a sudden, do they not trust me? If they don't trust me, why should I trust them?
But doesn't the government have a reason not to trust gun owners, looking at the gun violence in the United States, also looking at recent tragedies, Connecticut, for example, 26 people dying? Does that not compel a government to do something about gun ownership and control?
Well, I would hope not. If we use that same logic, then we ought to ban automobiles and alcohol, because they're horrible tragedies that occur every day in the United States with cars and drunk drivers. Similarly, instead of talking about guns as though guns have some form of teleology that can think, it's the person that has to use or misuse that tool. It's just a tool.
I agree with you that it is about the people, but clearly we have people in society who use guns to harm others. So why is it that this bill then, that was meant to make it possible to have expanded background checks, why did it not pass through?
Well, actually, our organization supported the bill, but sometimes in politics everywhere, politics will trump policy. It was not done correctly, and I think there'll be another attempt, and we certainly plan on playing a role in that next attempt at passing that legislation.
I understood that about 80%, obviously statistics can be debated, but 80% of Americans actually supported that bill. That's why there was so much shock in the world when it didn't pass through, and therefore demonstrating the power of the gun lobbyists, that they have the money, they have the power, and ultimately they prevailed.
Well, you know, there's some truth to what you say, but only some. You know, you can ask people in a poll question anything you want and get some interesting answers, but the only poll that really matters to elected officials is the one on election day. And gun owners care very deeply about their gun rights in the United States, and they actually will vote for or against officials on the basis of what they do on this issue. Almost by definition, people who don't care about guns, who don't own guns, they can give you an answer in a poll, but they're not going to vote for you or against you on the basis of what you do on this issue. Furthermore, you never have to worry about the views of the majority in a democracy. It's always about protecting the rights of the minority, not the majority.
All right, American democracy. Let's find out then how it was done in the South African democracy. We have some tough gun legislation, but we do have high incidence of gun-related crime. We'll hear all about it from my next guest. If someone is familiar with the repercussions of guns in the wrong hands, it is Anthony Altbeker, government advisor and award-winning author. Anthony has played a critical part in shaping South Africa's post-democracy criminal justice system and in reducing gun crime here. Welcome, Anthony. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Legislation, we have legislation in South Africa. Has it worked to reduce gun-related crime?
Well, there's certainly some evidence that it has. South Africa is a very violent country. We've got a murder rate that has halved in the last 12 years or so. It's still within the top 10 of the most murderous societies in the world. The halving of the murder rate has been accompanied by a big decline in homicides committed with firearms. So it's hard to say that the legislation itself drove the decline in firearm-related murders. But clearly what didn't happen, which is what the gun lobby was saying would happen, is that tougher legislation would result in a spike of crime, that there'd be more violence in society as the gun legislation got tougher. Well, that hasn't really been the case.
What's your response to the gun lobby in South Africa arguing that the law is meant to disarm law-abiding citizens who, like Richard, use their guns responsibly, but the criminals just fall through the cracks?
Because we're a violent society, a lot of people will feel unsafe without a firearm. Richard was talking about some of the issues relating to trust and trust of government. I don't think that resonates terribly much in South African debates about firearms. I think that's a fairly peculiar aspect of the American debate about firearms. It's not really a feature in the rest of the world's discussions about it. Here it's really about safety. It's really about whether people feel safe with or without a firearm.
But what are the facts there? I know in 1997 you did some research using a crime-infested area in Alexander Township as well as the suburb of Bramley, and you found that actually 25% actually of people that you surveyed actually get the chance to use their guns to protect themselves.
In the cases in which the victim had a firearm, he or she was 4 times more likely to lose the firearm to the attacker than he or she was to use it in self-defense. Having said that, people who use firearms in self-defense don't necessarily go to the police to report that they've done so. But it certainly does seem to be the case that criminals in South Africa, often very aggressively, one of the first things that they're demanding from victims are their firearms.
Let's talk about Oscar Pistorius. Richard talked about responsible use and that guns should be kept away from the wrong hands. And that is where the problem lies. How do you determine which hands are wrong? We have an Olympiad who grabbed global headlines, was a hero for many, many people. Who would have thought that on the 14th of February this year, he would shoot and kill his girlfriend? And I understand he owned about 6 guns. In your view, does Oscar Pistorius qualify to own guns?
Well, it's very easy in retrospect, perhaps, to say that he doesn't. I mean, firstly, we have to acknowledge that his account of what happened is that he was afraid. He thought somebody had broken into the house, and he was reacting as a man, in fear and panic might react. Having said that, there do appear to be a range of previous incidents in which inappropriate use of a firearm has featured in his life story. So, it is important to know that someone like Oscar, living in the community in which he does, there is a lot of fear about crime. Some of that fear is exaggerated. So there are newspapers in South Africa that will put on every second or third day, there'll be a front page story about a middle-class household that's been the victim of a serious and aggressive crime. People have a greatly exaggerated sense of the risk that they face. But this is clearly a man who had a fairly aggressive response to these circumstances, and whose previous incidents, supposedly granting for the moment that they've all been accurately reported, suggest that he might not have been a real candidate as a responsible firearm owner.
And 6 guns, is that a lot? Should there be a limit, or it really doesn't matter whether they've got 1 gun or 150 guns? It's how you're going to use that weapon.
It does appear, and I mean, this is very hard for someone like me to talk about because I don't get it ultimately, but it does appear that there is a certain amount of pleasure that that some firearm owners get from firing different kinds of weapons. So you do have to figure that into the calculation. Richard did talk about vehicles and guns, and there's a truth to that. I mean, it's obviously true that if there were no firearms, there'd be no firearm deaths. If there were no cars, there would be no car accidents. I think one way I would qualify and comment on that is that I think it's overwhelmingly clear that the kind of social value we get from having cars is net positive. I think the big debate is it a net positive for people to have firearms?
Richard, you want to come in here?
Yes, this is a great question that you pose, and it's one I'm particularly interested in because it's something that Nelson Mandela said when he addressed the joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C. in 1990. He said that liberty and equality are essential, fundamental human rights and must, if necessary, be defended with the weapons of war. We've always interpreted that to be civilian ownership. Is there another interpretation that I might be missing?
I'm positive that Nelson Mandela would have been talking about the ANC's decision to embark on armed struggle back in the 60s.
And not necessarily an individual's rights.
Not necessarily talking about an individual's rights to an unlimited individual right to firearm ownership. I do think that this linking of firearm ownership and ideas of liberty is a much stronger feature of the American debate about firearms than it is almost anywhere else in the world. I think there are countries where owning a firearm is very intrinsically linked to being a man. I mean, the Swiss all own firearms, and I think the Afghans all own firearms. But I don't think that certainly it's not in South Africa. In South Africa, the idea that the right to a firearm is intrinsically linked to the quality of our liberty, I don't think resonates.
Gun-related crimes in the United States, the mass killings, they make headlines everywhere. And while we have this crime that we're experiencing in South Africa, I cannot think, Anthony, that we've had a situation where a crazed gun owner goes into a school and wipes out 26 people, all at once. Shouldn't that be more important than an individual's desire or commitment to his or her own liberty and rights?
What's often missed across my country and certainly around the world is this several million times a year that civilians use handguns to protect themselves. So if they didn't have those guns, they wouldn't be able to protect themselves. Wouldn't that be a lot more crime? I know as a matter of personal, and not when I was a police officer, I never pulled my gun, but as a civilian, I did have 2 times in my life where I was very thankful I had a gun with me. I never needed to use the gun, but I was effective at preventing a robbery from occurring.
Anthony, does Richard have a point here that the research that we have tells us about gun-related crime, homicide, intimate partner crime, but it doesn't tell us how many crimes were prevented as a result of gun ownership?
Yeah, we don't have data on that. When the legislation was going through Parliament, the South African Gun Owners Association presented some survey-based evidence, but frankly, the methodology was laughable. I know I've been held up. If I had a firearm, it wouldn't have done me any good. People can defend themselves in some circumstances, but the point is that they don't choose the circumstances of their own victimization.
The element of surprise that is to the advantage
correct.
of the illegal gun user. But Richard, would you move to Japan? Do you envy the safety of their society?
Well, I would move to Japan because I love sashimi.
But you wouldn't be able to take your 150 guns.
I don't think I could take them even in my own country to certain states. I would be a felon for possessing some of the guns in a state like New York, which is one of the reasons I live in New Hampshire, where our motto of our state is live free or die.
But do you think there are any lessons to learn from Japan and its low gun-related crime statistics? What can we learn from Japan?
When you live in a society that everyone has a very common background, they are a different kind of society than any mixed society, certainly the United States of America, where people live from around the world. It's a very different kind of society.
And Anthony, again, this would be relevant for South Africa. Do we have any lessons to learn from that, given that we've got this cultural and racial and religious diversity that the United States also have?
I'd be hesitant to kind of pluck Japan out of the universe of possible examples to learn lessons from. It is a country that is quite unique with an ancient culture, and it's a very established society and a very peaceful society, and a society clearly where it has a murder rate that is, something approaching 1/100th of South Africa's. Now, that's not exclusively about access to firearms. There's a lot going on in that. I do think, though, that in a society in which you have a lot of people who will use violence at some point in their lives, I think that kind of society needs to be very careful about how it manages access to firearms.
Because there are also socioeconomic factors as well, the presence of drugs in society,
and
all
just
of that
the kind
related.
of momentum and the inertia of it. I think violence does breed violence on some levels. The fact that we are a violent society yesterday helps explain why we are a violent society today.
Richard?
You really just touched on what is now becoming one of the emerging issues for discussion in the United States of America, which is that correlation between our war on drugs and gun violence. And in my discussions with dozens of narcotics officers around the USA who suggest that anywhere between 35 and 50% of gun violence is directly attributable to control over illegal drugs, which leads one into a very different discussion. If the prime interest is reduction in harm, compare and contrast then, what should we be doing as a society about drugs?
You first touched a gun when you were 12, is that true?
I think I might have actually been 10 or 11.
Where did you get a gun? Your mom and your dad, they were not gun owners. Where did you access a gun at age whatever?
I went to summer camp, and one of the things at summer camp they all taught back then was .22 riflery practice. And I enjoyed it back then, and was very safe.
Well, Anthony and I won't be sending our children to that camp. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us on South to North. Anthony, a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for joining me on South to North. Remember, you can tweet your questions, comments, and opinions to @AJ South to North or find us on Facebook. See you next week. Bye-bye.